Okay, everybody. Thank you, Tom, for chairing the meeting so far. I'm just going to step in to try and orchestrate some of the discussion, and hopefully some of the other speakers will who are still here will turn on their cameras so that we can think about questions that have emerged. I can see that that's happening already. Thank you very much. I mean, I think the thing that I just wanted to say to start with, in terms of this whole meeting, and hat to Tom for organising this, was just that we're aware that a number of departments have embraced R in terms of undergraduate teaching, and you've heard from some of these examples. But there are many departments who have maybe staff who are using R in their own research, but aren't at a point where everybody or the majority of people in the department are doing it. So it seemed like it was a good opportunity to actually look at the experiences that people went through, and also, as Mark explained, and as Andy Field explained, there are a variety of supporting resources and ways to facilitate that teaching and that conversion for those who are thinking about doing this at a department level. And clearly it's not just like switching a light on and off of choosing to go to one or other package. I think one of the other themes is that from today is the different sort of consequences from that decision to move. And anyway, we've got a few questions, and I'd like to ask the presenters some of the questions that we've got. But just to kick off, one of the things that I think might be useful for the audience to know is, to what extent do you think, having moved to R, the students learn the same, or learn more or less, or learn differently, having transitioned to R in your department experience?
Do you want us to just jump in?
Yeah, just jump in.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know. I would love to say that they learn more, they learn better, but to be honest, I don't know. It would take a serious analysis to do that to definitively and I can imagine how, if different people who've got different preconceptions about the value of art did that, they would come to different conclusions. So I think that what we have noticed at NTU, and by the way, my colleague Lucy Justice is maybe still here. She has been in charge of the first year module. I think what we've noticed is that it's not the students' perception of statistics and the fear they have and so on. That is not worse. It may be better, but it's not worse than it ever was. So the SPSS students I don't think were finding SPSS easier, less intimidating, more enjoyable. Than R. And I think the problems that a lot of students have with statistics are not really about the software. It's about the concepts.
Thanks, Mark. Andy, I see you've got your hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I think postgrad level, I think our master's students are overachieving what master's students did when we used to teach them SPSS. Like, it's a pretty intense module, but they're, obviously self-selecting and everything, and they do amazing stuff. At undergrad level, completely anecdotally, and with the caveat that we changed our curriculum alongside, as I said earlier, 2 national strikes and a pandemic, the effect it seems to have had, you always get this bimodal distribution, and they've drifted a bit further apart. So the students that struggle a bit more than they used to. But that's anecdotally looking at kind of our typical distributions across the years. But there could be other reasons for that as well. We've changed a lot of stuff.
Emily, do you want to come in?
Yes, but I mean, as Andy was saying, like I see it really in the conversion course students, that what the conversion course students are able, what they come out of Glasgow being able to achieve is just so far beyond what I think a lot of other conversion programs are doing. And yeah, I mean, I agree with Mark that it's actually being able to have any data that would support this one way or the other is incredibly difficult, as I'm sure everyone here is aware of, because you're constantly trying to prove that it works, and it is very hard to do so. But I think from a skills perspective, if we frame it from kind of employability and what is our responsibility to teach students, then purely from an employability perspective and the skills that we're teaching, it is a no-brainer that we're doing a better job for our students. A lot of our graduates are now looking at data science jobs. I had my own dissertation student last year who came to me and she was like, I don't like stats and I don't like and whatever, and I was like, that's fine, we'll get through it. And her job that she got is now teaching people Python. She never learned Python at Glasgow, but it transferred. And that, I think, is like, I think it's a really shallow way to look at it and go, did the grades improve like this? Or, have they learned what a t-test is better? Like, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. It's like the entire skill set that you're giving them and the way that they can look at data and use data in their future jobs, whatever that might be.
Thanks, Emily. Rob, I can see you've got your hand up.
I think Emily just made my point, to be honest. But what I guess in what we did see, I mean, we've got a problem in terms of data, because we're kind of asking students, how is your life better given what we've just done with you? It's like, tell me to my face, and we're only going to get biased and limited evidence in that way. And the modular evaluations are terrible as sources of information, so got to rule those out too. But when you do get students emailing you and saying, hey, I got a job interview because I said that I learned R at Lancaster. Well, okay, yeah, they don't do it a lot. It'd be nice if we followed our outcomes better than we do as an institution, but that really seems to work. I think the main thing, though, it seems to me in terms of teaching, is not so much the nitty-gritty of the practicalities of like tidyverse stuff or whatever. It's the opportunity to, and this is where I reflect what Emily's saying, it's the opportunity to do stuff in the world in a supported fashion, in the world as in writing stuff, code that has an effect, and changing it or breaking it, and learning to handle those sorts of feelings and changing and breaking things. That stuff I think is really important, because once you do that in one context, you can go on and do it in a whole bunch of other contexts. I think the only way I got to be comfortable with problem solving in art was because as a kid I'd done like basic programming at BBC Bees at GCSE, and I thought, hey, it's doable. It's always going to be doable, and that realization is something essentially that we're teaching. That's almost the point, I think, of teaching art, is that giving students the opportunity to have that realization. You can.
Great, thanks, Robert. I'm going to bring in Andy Wills, who's had his hand up, and then Mark for maybe the final word before we move on to some other questions. Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested seeing some of the comments as we went along. This was an R symposium, so I talked about R. In some ways, R is both the most and the least important part of this discussion. It's the most important, I think, like Emily said as well, it's the most important because I can't imagine doing some of the things we wanted to do in the other options. So that's one of the reasons we went for R. But it was the things we wanted to do that were the important thing, and people have mentioned this. So realistic data analysis with large, messy data sets, reproducible analyses where the entire path is there, problem-based teaching where the goal here is to get some data, answer a question, and stats is a way of getting to that. All of these things. Oh, and of course, we switched at the same time from NHST to Bayesian statistics. That would have been, JASP is another option, which I accept, but in SPSS, at the time at least, that would have been very difficult. So it was a tool that allowed us to do the things we wanted to do. Have the students got better? Well, I showed you some slides at the beginning of my talk. There is no way any of our students produce visualizations anything like that in the old curriculum. There's no way that any of them understood p-values. Some of them now do understand base factors because, frankly, they're a bit more easy to understand. And I think that's one of the things to bear in mind when you're doing a change like this, is that your students don't come with the baggage that you have. They don't know SPSS. If you don't teach them null hypothesis incidence testing first, they don't know what that is as a primary measure. We include it in the curriculum because otherwise they can't understand some of the papers they read. But they're starting afresh, and it's an opportunity to get them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And they've been surprising our staff. One of the things that was on the staff email list in this first of our project years was, well, that was a very different conversation about projects. I asked the student, what do you think we should do in terms of analysis? They said, oh, we probably need to do a Bayesian ANOVA, at which point a member of staff needed to then go away and find out what a Bayesian ANOVA was. That point where staff are being prompted to learn things from their undergraduate students at a average entry grades undergraduate program is, to me, anecdotal evidence that we're doing something right.
Thanks, Andy. Mark, over to you.
Very briefly, just about this general issue about whether things have got better. I think, as so many other people have said, it's a limited question is whether they are learning, for example, their t-test better, and we just need to remember that what we're doing now is we're teaching a much broader set of skills and a much greater range of topics. And the point that Rob made in his talk about the digital natives, that always gets me as well, how students are we're told, and students are told that they're digital natives, when in fact their computing skills are maybe more limited than they were of those of a few decades ago, because they never had to learn whatever programming on a ZX Spectrum or something like that. So I think that we are teaching them very valuable real world skills that they were not being taught, at least not in psychology departments. And so, that we need to remember that we're doing much more than just teaching the curriculum, the standard curriculum, in another way.
Rob?
I think Andy's hand was up first, actually. But
okay, I didn't know if that was a legacy hand from Andy Wills. Did you want to come back?
Yeah,
Andy Wills.
Just a point that in this, we do have good motivation in terms of the outcomes. I think, target outcomes in terms of employability skills and things like that. I think that's true, and that's certainly how we have to talk about it also in the context of institutional requirements. But I also want to say that there's an ethical motivation. There's not just a pull factor, but there's a push factor for me as a teacher of ours, an ethical motivation. And I think it may be shared, which is the sense that it's important that we teach this method using these tools because of these ethical requirements in terms of transparency, openness, reproducibility, and empowerment. And I think, in a sense, it's almost irrespective of the outcomes. It's just, I need to do this because this is the right thing to do, as it were.
Cheers, thanks, Rob. I want to ask everybody a different question that's come up in different ways across this afternoon. And that's just to ask you briefly to comment, in your view, how much do you think it's important, or a kind of an option you might want to pursue to get students to work with R Markdown? So a number of you have talked at different levels about, just get them to do R, or, we want to get R Markdown, and we want a reproducible output that they submit and mark and so on. And questions have come up during the day about how much people think this might be important or a step too far and so on. So I'd just like comment from each of you about where you think you are on the experiences of what you've taught. So maybe this time I'll go from my screen top right round. So Emily, could I ask you to come in, because it was something that I know does feature at Glasgow.
Yeah, it does feature. So we use Markdown in the undergraduate degree because of using Assessor. So that's just how the assessments are set up. And then we use Markdown for the pre-registration for the conversion course, which is where they do have to do this reproducible document. for the MSCs I have, and in some aspects for the undergrads, they are shown about inline coding and how how you would write a fully reproducible report, although they never have to write the full report in Markdown. So it's kind of it's there. Could you do what we're doing, with the exception of Assessor, without Markdown? Probably, yes. But I also think that I think there's something about the way Markdown's set up that is easier for learners, in that you can have, you can write a bunch of text and you can write your comments and your notes about what you're doing and then have the code chunk. And I think comments, you don't get the depth that you can put into a Markdown file. So I would say that I prefer Markdown because it allows them to produce something that looks more like a document, and I think it's more familiar. But I don't think, yeah, you could do it. You could do it without. This is not a hill I would die on, put it that way.
Okay, thanks, Emily. If I could turn next to you, Andy Wills. To what extent have you found it's a good thing or a necessary thing, or just unnecessary?
This might be quite quick. We took the decision very early on to not use our Markdown for the undergraduate course. It's used in the master's course, and the reason for that was that if we were going to do it, it would need to come early, I think, and we were concerned about overwhelming the students with learning too many different things at the same time. I think there were some other things we did that we are going to change, and we'll change for next year. Like, I think we'll introduce projects earlier, because I think that does help. But I think as long as you've got projects, you don't necessarily need Markdown for the early teaching stages. And I think it's a by-course judgment. I think our students, who are pretty average on entry and are mostly non-science entry, I was just worried it would be the straw that broke the camel's back.
Okay, Mark Andrews, I see you've got your hand up. So do you want to come in next?
Yeah, sure. So I teach an advanced undergraduate module where students do data analysis on various advanced using relatively advanced methods, and all their coursework is then submitted through writing R Markdown reports, and they must submit the source code and then the rendered PDF as well. And I've been doing that for about 4 or 5 years, and it's wonderful, and the students, I think, are amazed at the quality of the reports that they produce. So it's going really well in that module. Now, of course, that's an advanced module. The students are choose it, and they're very confident students. However, what I want to do, and it is actually a hill I will die on, is get all our lab reports in at least second year, but ideally I would like in first year, for them to be written in R Markdown as well. So at the moment, our students do analysis in R, and they're doing the copying of results from R terminal into Word documents, and they're making copy and paste errors, and then the code that is being used to produce any particular figure or table or whatever is lost, and they can do that so much better in such a more reproducible way using our Markdown, and the results of it as well, especially if you use PDF. LaTeX is there's so much higher quality than the Word documents, and so I really want us to get there. Now, as I'm saying, it's a hill that I will die on, because I think it's going to be in another big battle in our department, because we've got almost 100 staff who are involved in these big research methods modules, and they will have to learn about R Markdown. And I would say the vast majority of them at the moment never used it, and so it'll just be one of those big battles that we've got as well. So I'm raising this topic with the kind of the fanatics in the R teaching fanatics, and not everybody is as committed as I am to it, but it is something that I want to bang on about. So ultimately, what I'm saying here is for lab reports, so data analysis based lab reports, I would like that all to be done using R Markdown, and not only does it produce better results, but it teaches that core topic, fundamental topic of reproducible data analysis, which we're just not doing as well as we can, which we can't do as well as we could otherwise do using R Markdown.
Okay, Rob, and then Andy Field. Do you have any comments?
We haven't taught our Markdown, and I've thought about it, and I think we should pilot it in a master's program. And what I've done up to this point is just do little demonstrations and say, look, do you want to see some magic? Here you go. Here's a PDF in APA format. And I think it's one of those things again where, like I said in the talk, is you have this kind of, in a sense, there's an ethical requirement where if you benefit in these ways from these capacities, then ultimately you're going to have to just teach it, so you can transfer that benefit to your students. And I think we should pilot it. So we haven't done it yet, but we should pilot it. I think in a sense, I'm a bit more worried about version control, and I wonder if there's if there's a time trade-off to make. I'd like, maybe I could do version control with them, and then, I don't know, can we do, we have to make choices, don't we, in terms of finite time and finite resources and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of things in my mind where I really want to do it, and I do really want to do Markdown, and I do really want to do, version control, basically. So.
Okay, cheers. Andy Field, how's it been for you?
We do teach Markdown, and that was, on the whole, my decision that I imposed on everyone, so they can blame me for it. I do it at master's level and it works great, and I think a lot of students get really into it and get into like downloading templates and all the rest of it. But they don't have to, that's not a requirement, but there's a sort of differentiated learning aspect where on the forums and stuff, people will start asking me questions about how to style things with CSS and stuff like that, which is kind of nice. At undergrad level, we keep things pretty simple. We don't teach anything, so it's always knitted to HTML. We don't do anything with PDFs. Involving LaTeX is, that's a minefield that I don't want to negotiate my way through, both from an IT, university IT perspective, or trying to get students installing LaTeX on their own computers. I just don't think that's worth the effort, personally.
There's an easier way. Sorry for interrupting. There's actually an easier way to do it now. I just want to mention that TinyTech. It makes it actually very easy. It's an R package.
Okay, I'm still not doing it, but thanks. So the main reason for doing it is I mean, it's basically what Emily said. It creates a more familiar end product for students. They can write a report. There's some text. We teach them some basic Markdown stuff. We don't do anything tremendously complicated. One thing we do is avoid, well, we didn't last year, but I think we're going to avoid having formal assessments at undergrad level that require a knitted Markdown document, because it creates so much stress when things won't knit. So we're going to use it for kind of things that don't have big weightings attached to them. And the other thing to say about that is, having used Markdown for some lab reports in the sort of first iteration of these modules, we all kind of came to the conclusion that we're not actually going to get students doing their final year dissertations in Markdown. I mean, that I think would be hugely problematic. So in a sense, if we're training them to do reports in Markdown, we're training them for something they're not ultimately going to use in their final year. So in this academic cycle, we are still teaching Markdown, but only for sort of producing informal reports and just as a way to interact with so that what Emily said. So you get nice reports with nice comments on, and it looks pretty.
Okay, I mean, I think from as a round table, what's really valuable for the audience out there is the fact that there are examples of moving to R without Markdown, and there's been some success with that. There are also attempts or also programs that have used Markdown and have integrated it, and that's also kind of worked out. And Mark talking about advocating for using it more. I think the idea is, if people are going back to their own departments, this is something they can have conversations around as to what's likely to work in their department or institutional context, and there might be different ways of doing it. I had one more question that I wanted to ask from throughout earlier today before going to questions that have come up in this particular session. And I get the feeling that there's been a repeated set of questions around the amount of space that's been needed to teach R. And so I just want to ask almost like a more specific question, to the extent that you can separate out all the changes that were going on at the same time. Have you delivered R with the same teaching contact hours that you had before you used it? As I said, I know that it was when everything else was changing, but let me rephrase that question slightly differently then. For somebody who might be doing it next year or the year after, can they do it with the same space for methods and analysis that they've currently been working with SPSS or something else, or will it require more? Andy Field, could you start on that one?
Yeah, our timetabling is almost exactly the same. We don't have the capacity to, I mean, we can barely timetable things as it is. So if we ask for any other sessions, they'll just get refused. So we're pretty much doing what we did before. If anything, we possibly have slightly fewer contact hours than when we taught SPSS.
Okay, that's I think that's really helpful for people to know out there. Tom Beasley, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to give our perspective on, because we just developed it last year for Lancaster, and I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve with it. I mean, we sort of ripped up our labs and basically started again with what we're trying to achieve with the labs. We went much more for the data wrangling and visualization, which we'd never really had any focus on, as far as I could tell. Certainly not in first year, which I had sight of. So. And I did a lot of that Learn R tutorial stuff, which took hours and hours and hours, as Andy will know, to learn all about that and to develop those bits. And I certainly went to Hod and sort of made my case that this was taking a long time, but it was going to be very beneficial, which they sort of shrugged their shoulders a bit really and said, okay, well, fair enough. But yeah, it took a long time, but we were trying, I was trying to achieve a lot, and we were trying to achieve a lot with our course last year and really ripping it up. So I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Over to Emily. You've got your hand up.
So I wasn't at Glasgow when the change was first introduced, so I can't give the exact comparison. But I suppose two things. First, for level one, our level one teaching in our with that Scottish 4-year thing, so it's slowed down. There's no interventions in the first year, but it actually translates to about 6 hours over the entire academic year of in-class time. That's what it is. It's not actually, it's not actually a huge time burden. There's then the GTA support sessions, but it's not like we're spending, hours and hours a week teaching this stuff. And just, I will reiterate my point that you make time for the things that you think are important. If you think about what you're actually using your time to teach, there's choices to be made.
Thanks, Emily. So Mark, and then Andy Wills, and then Rob. Oh, you're muted, Mark.
Thick. Sorry. So my response to this would be like two answers, really. Like, one is that I think that it can be taught in the same amount of contact time. And the only issue you would face that is about teaching all these new topics. So in other words, if you had been teaching a kind of a relatively standard curriculum, you wouldn't have been teaching data wrangling. And now if you're teaching R, you then have this sort of opportunity to teach data wrangling. And so you must find time for that. And so you have a resource issue, not because of R, but because there's new topics that you can now more easily teach. But just having said that, we are trying to increase the amount of contact time we have, and we're doing that in a few creative ways, but it will involve more online teaching next year than we had previously planned. So so that obviously is easier to organize because you don't have the physical constraints, and so we will be trying to increase the contact time by a certain amount. I think I actually don't know all the details of it.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So yeah, Andy Wills, and then Rob.
Hi. Yeah, I think similar answers really. I mean, we completely changed our curriculum in almost every regard, and teaching statistics and research methods in a different way was part of that. So the comparison is very hard to make, not least because our contact hours in total are higher than they used to be. If I had to make a guess, then I'd say the proportion of contact time dedicated to research methods in total is probably higher than it was, but that's not fundamentally because of R. That's because of, well, in our old curriculum, they basically just did what they were told until they got to their dissertation and then were left adrift to do their own project. We fade much more now, so students have done 3 or 4 projects of increasing complexity before they get to the final year. That obviously requires more time and more supervision than not doing that. So yeah, more time in total, possibly a slightly higher proportion, but because of what we chose to do. If you wanted to run, and I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to run exactly the same course you were running, but with R rather than SPSS, then it probably wouldn't take any more time. I'd also wonder why, to be honest. It seems a lot of effort to go to for a relatively small benefit.
Thanks, Andy. So, final word to you, Rob, and then I'll open this up to the audience for questions.
We in teaching our over the years from 2014 at master's level, we basically fit the classes in the same size box, didn't get more hours. The difference was, I think we went from having 1 group GTA to 2 GTAs in the course. So there's a bit of extra resourcing. And I think the reality is that the other difference is that basically there was a trade-off, and I think Emily picked up on this earlier, where you're basically making decisions. So we're saying we're going to do more coding, we're doing more wrangling, so we're going to do less of 1 test a week, which is like the traditional sort of method of teaching statistics. Was always t-test, and over correlation regression. I said we're not going to do that. We're going to do linear models, linear mixed effects models. I'm going to wrap it in terms of wrangling and visualization. And if you want to learn about factor analysis, go do it yourself, sort of thing. So basically, it's in order to fit the core teaching aims in the same size box, I had to make decisions around content, and I sort of chose to dispense with 1 test a week in order to facilitate that.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Rob. So, Diane, you've had your hand up for an awfully long time. So I think you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself, Diana, and ask it? Okay, well, we'll come back to Diana's question when it comes in. So first of all, is there any other question? Because I don't just want to ask the questions I've read throughout. Oh, I've seen a hand go up. Is that you, Mark? Do you want to ask a question or make a comment?
I want to ask a question. I think a number of people are interested in this as well on the basis of the commentary. So we were using RStudio. So 2 things. We've got our own RStudio server in the department, which we have for staff. So I maintain that, and it's a great resource for staff. But what I'm concerned about is doing creating the same type of thing for our students, given that would mean that I would have to maintain about 3,000 student accounts. And so that's the thing I'm concerned about. So I was just wondering, how does Andy, Wills, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with all the student accounts? Who creates them? Who maintains them? I presume the students are using their own passwords for their Plymouth University passwords for the server. Is that the case?
No, it's not.
Okay.
So we have about 1,500 active users on the system. The way user accounts is handled is there's just a script, and it's run by our tech support office. It was written by a member of staff, but it's run by our tech support office. That script is fed in a list of student emails, which we get from Central IT Services. They're all emailed with a username and unique password.
Okay.
And if they lose their username and unique password, then they contact the tech office to ask what it is again.
Yeah. Okay.
And the only effort from our perspective is you do need to remember to remind them a few times in the week before the first class that they do in fact need to have read this email and try to log in. And it causes basically no admin support over the year for us. And I don't think much for the tech office either. Certainly less than what was happening for the postgraduate program when we were having them install, which was just a stream of people with their laptops by the tech office window saying, I can't get R to work, when actually the answer was, your 10-year-old laptop is fundamentally broken.
Sure. So that's really interesting to know. And when you say the tech office, is that is that a university or is that a departmental?
No, we're lucky enough to have a department resource here.
Yeah.
It's really fantastic, actually. Now they're not. It doesn't tax them very much, to be honest. But they are brilliant here. They write web applications for us, and they write many of the student projects in JavaScript and that kind of thing. So we're very lucky. But it takes, I would say, a few days at a busy time of year to deal with that, which is why I'm glad someone else is doing it, because I'm trying to teach the course at that point.
Yeah.
But
So
it's not hard. We have the script if you want it.
Yeah, so I've actually got scripts to create all these accounts, but what I was more concerned about is the I forget my password issue, and how are you going to deal with that? But just one last question. Is your server physically located in Plymouth, or is it on a is it a VPS?
It's a dedicated machine, but not in the building. So it's
is it in the university?
Not in the university, somewhere.
Yeah.
But it is a dedicated machine. I don't think that, in retrospect, was necessary.
Yeah, no, I was just, the issue I was worrying about there was that the RStudio server that I maintain is within our university's firewall. So it just means that the staff who use that have to use like a VPN client, which is fine, but it's just that I would prefer if students didn't have to use a VPN client to access our RStudio server. For that, the server would have to be outside the university's firewall.
Yeah.
But it sounds like yours is. Yeah.
Ours is. You can go there now if you want. You can't log in because you haven't got login detail. But yeah, it's worldwide available in that sense. Yeah, and as you know, because this is more for other people, right? But you've run it. I wouldn't try and set one of these things up or maintain it if you didn't know a bit about Linux to start with. But if you've got, in our case, a couple of people on staff who do, I probably spend a total of about a day a year on RStudio server, split up roughly equally between the occasional it's fallen over, and it's good to have a couple of people there to pick it up again if you can, but that happens very rarely. So, and the other one is doing the annual upgrades, so everything's up to date, and that's half a day's work for each of two people probably.
So it's really interesting because you obviously there are technical issues and there's like maintenance to do, but there's also a lot of maintenance to do when students are working on 5,000 or 3,000 to 5,000 different devices, some of which are completely out of date.
That was it, and I wanted, I was writing these materials, and one of the things that came up when I was trying them with staff first was that the output that I was showing on my materials, the materials are Markdown, was not quite the same as they were seeing on the screen, and that really confused the staff, let alone our first year students. And so the only way we could fully avoid that was to have the materials compiled on exactly the same versions of R and packages as you were using, and the only way to achieve that is to have a standard install. And there are two ways to achieve that. One is to do what we did, and the other is to do what I saw in the comments, which is to convince your IT department to put it on all public machines. But the problem with that, of course, is then a student can't do it unless they have access to a public machine, which is a pain in most years and was probably a disaster in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob, I see you've got your hand up. I want to go to a question from Kenneth in the audience. Is it about this, to round this topic, Rob, that you want to say something, or is it something else?
Different topic. I can wait then.
Can I come back to you in a couple of minutes? Yeah. Okay. So, Kenneth maybe had your hand up for a while. Do you want to come in and ask?
Sure, thanks. I guess what I find really interesting about this discussion, I really appreciated the discussion today. I'm an old hand at SPSS. I've got nothing against R per se, but I guess what I wanted to kind of get us to reflect upon is the larger cycles of these things. So I've been supporting SPSS since the 80s. So there was a time before there was an SPSS where everybody was just writing their own code in Fortran, and then someone assembled it together and created SPSS and created syntax to make it easier, and then more syntax to make it more easy, and then eventually a GUI interface, initially, which just actually created the code, which they then still ran, and then eventually point and click and all the rest of it. So I do remember how enthusiastic users were when SPSS switched from syntax to point and click. So, I think that, perhaps foolish to forget that was a sort of vote with your feet type exercise. There was also a point at which it was commercialized and went from being a university run thing out of Canada to become an IBM product, and there's all sorts of issues around that. So I just want to remind us of the bigger picture, because we sometimes forget that R is also in an evolutionary kind of process, right? R is not a static thing, and even the things you've talked about today kind of show evolution over the last 5 to 10 years and so forth. JASP, is a kind of early, JASP and Jamovia kind of early toes in the water in terms of developing a user interface and so forth. I mean, there's an earlier Unix version that wasn't terribly good, but now, those are actually pretty good. So I guess putting that bigger frame in mind, because my question is, in 5 to 10 years, which are the things that you're now passionate about, which you'll be happy to let go of in the overall evolution of what's possible, and which things will you want to hold on to? So that's my kind of bigger question.
Okay, who wants to have a stab at answering that first?
Well, I can try. I do occasionally have 10-year plans, but they don't tend to work out very well. So I don't know, if we're talking about software for a moment, and I've tried to make the point that I don't think it's mainly about software, but if we are talking about software, then I genuinely believe that it is better for research to be based on open source software, because it means that, particularly a GPL based license, because it means it can't be hidden behind a paywall at some later date. And so if there was a core here where I could see things changing around but my enthusiasm would stay, it would be a system where the underlying code was open source, and where there was a scripting engine where you could write human readable code, and there was a system where the full analysis path was doable in a scripted fashion. And I think, to be honest, whilst most of those things are achievable in SPSS, it's amazing how much we haven't managed to teach people how to do the full data path in SPS syntax, and how we haven't taught them. I don't, to be honest, know how to do this, because I stopped using SPSS about 10 years ago. How you produce graphs that don't look terrible, where the answer is then to just recreate them in Excel, which means you probably get them wrong. So yeah, that would be my stab at an answer.
Okay, Tom Beasley, you had your hand up, and then I'll ask if anybody else amongst the presenters wants to comment.
I didn't really have too much more than Andy sort of said then, and what Lisa had said in the chat. Really, the goal, if your goal is to, continue using a GUI-based statistics tool, then yeah, converting to JASP would be a good option, and that would do it for you. But I think for all of us here, it's more than that, and it's about reproducibility, but it's also about taking a different approach to research methods and going a bit deeper in terms of what we're trying to get students to do with processing their data. And Emily talked a lot about that, and where they want their students to be when they get to the end of their course, and that's very much been our view of it here when we were sort of designing our course. What do we want our students to be able to achieve by the time they get to their projects? We want them to have some ability to handle data and to visualize it before they get to the inferential statistics. So it's not just a like-for-like replacement.
Okay, I'm just looking around at my video feed to see if there are other questions. Okay, I want one more chance to bring in Diana, because her hand has been up. Diana, if you do want to unmute yourself and ask the question that you have.
I guess, as you may have gathered, I'm an enthusiast of JASP because it has many of the advantages that R has, especially for students who are not going to be at the forefront of statistical analyses. I do understand that for some students, laying the foundations in R is going to be wonderful for their future career. But it seems to me for most people, and from the point of view of understanding what it is when they read another paper and somebody says, the t-test said this, and the post hoc probability was this, with these credibility levels, say, that for them to understand that, it's mostly there in JASP. And I think just as SPSS moved to point and click, but it still always has the script behind. So with R, having got the ideas in JASP, moving from JASP to R is a lot easier than moving from SPSS to R. And I think that that's the future. The question I'm asking is, why don't more people use it? Obviously, this is a seminar devoted to teaching R, so it's maybe wrong to ask it here. But I am very interested in whether people have successfully used JASP.
Okay, Emily, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
So I think that the framing this as JASP versus R is not the framing that I've tried to talk about, and it's not the framing that I think most of the other speakers have tried to frame this about, which is that I am so pro JASP, and you know I've worked with departments as examiner and stuff where they're thinking about moving to R, and I'm like, do you know what, actually looking at a program, looking at your students, go for JASP. I think that's a better route. But the point is that we've talked about reproducibility, we've talked about things like data wrangling, and yes, JASP is this really great product, but you can't learn the data wrangling. It's still SPSS in what it's capable of, and yes, don't get me wrong, it is slightly broader, I know that. So I just, this framing of it is this tool versus that tool, I just don't think is helpful for this discussion. If you feel that you can use JASP to achieve the aims that you have, go for it. For me and for a number of other people on the panel, we believe that R is the tool that facilitates the things that we want to do. And yeah, I've lost my train of thought now. I just don't think it's a really helpful framing of this versus that. Yes, I use SPSS as an example, but
you're absolutely right. Framing it as which tool to use is not, in one sense, useful, but in another sense, departments across the country and the world have to decide which tool is going to be their major tool for psychology. And that's where I do think that in some sense it does need to be framed in terms of what is the tool we're going to recommend to all our departments.
Yes, I agree, and that it is about the tool at some level, but also you know, at Glasgow and the other institutions here, we've done years of work of implementing our curriculums into R and using R and evaluating the use of R and trying to, you know, do all this work about showing people what we've done and making our materials open source. If you want to go and do that with JASP, that would be great. Like,
Well,
I think we're having a discussion here. Like, it just seems that if people want to do the same for JASP if we've done for R, go for it. It seems like a false argument to say that us talking about R is stopping anybody else from doing what we've done in JASP. Those conversations can happen, and it's not this, you know.
You're right, but somebody just pointed out that they had a psychology HOD meeting where they were recommending that R be the tool for all the psychology departments. So and if it went that way, and frankly, I would regret that everybody was going for R. And I very much admire all the materials I've seen. What I'm less sure about is that well, for most people, for most students, of course, they won't need to go further. But yes, to what extent, for those who are that way inclined, yes, it will be a doorway. But the idea of imposing that on all the psychology departments, that really frightens me.
I mean, if we can get every single psychology department in the UK to agree to do the exact same thing, I will eat my hat and my legs and my shoes. You know, well, there might be, you know, again, what's happening at a local level is going to be years of discussion and debate and training and all of this stuff. It's not the case that it's not realistic to argue that the UK as a whole is going to adopt this one way of teaching it. I don't think that's what's happening. I'm going to stop now because I'm
okay. I'm also aware of the time.
There are wonderful tools.
Bring in Andy, and then Rob,
want to go that route
for this session to a close.
I've got to go.
Thanks very much.
Okay, goodbye.
Andy Field, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I totally agree with Emily's point that, yeah, it's horses for courses, isn't it? I don't think anyone's trying to say everyone has to do the same thing. One of the things that I think about teaching art and teaching coding in particular is, and this is a slightly utopian ideal that perhaps is not shared by anyone else, but there is a huge gender gap in coding skills. And as a subject that attracts predominantly female undergrads, we're in a really great position to help to close that gap, because there's all sorts of evidence that people learn skills better when it's in an environment that they're interested in. And you look at a lot of coding materials and it's all like baseball scores, and yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff is very male oriented, frankly. But we have an opportunity to teach these skills in a degree program that attracts a lot of women. And frankly, I think that's a great reason to teach coding.
Great, thanks, Andy. As I said, I'm very aware of the time, and this has been a long meeting, but also a really good meeting. And I think for many, it's really about the start of conversations within departments. So I do just want to take the time, first of all, to say thank you to Tom Beasley for setting up the meeting and these sessions. And secondly, to all the speakers who are currently on your screen for giving up their time to present, as well as also to come to this plenary, this general discussion. So thank you to all of you. Thank you also to everybody who's come to this session too. Despite some of the glitches, I think we've really learnt a lot and been able to do a lot this afternoon. So I'm going to call it there and say go off and enjoy some of this heat wave if you can. Thank you so much for coming, everybody, and look forward to seeing you, hopefully in person, before too long when it's safe to do so. Thank you.